Welcome to 73 Mentors. I am your co-host, Jason Vidari,
And I'm your other co-host, Vincent Vidari.
and today we are jumping into a new person. We are jumping into Karl Marx, as promised. Karl Marx, we're going to jump first into a little bit of his history, some of his early years, as we're going to spend on time on this podcast. After that, we're going to go more into his later years and more of his philosophy. But I guess I'll open up with this one quote. This is actually on his tombstone. Karl Marx is actually buried in London, for those of you which is interesting because he's a German, but he had an interesting life and moved for various places and ended up in London. But here's a quote on his tombstone. It says, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." And just a quick, kind of high view on Karl Marx. Of course, from that, people are probably familiar with the term Marxism and the sprouting of communist and socialist ideas that came from that, and governments that followed from, the USSR, the Soviet Union, what it was back then, to China, to various places around the world. Some of those thoughts and teachings from Karl Marx influenced, so quite influential. We have him on as our number 20 in top influential people of the world, or of all time. And really, in a large way, I guess probably affects our time here as we were speaking in 2018. His thoughts are still prevalent around the world, and I know there's somewhat of a resurgence of talking about him after the 2008 crash, in terms of his views on capitalism, what capitalism is and isn't, and what it should evolve into, I guess is one of his thoughts. But Vince, why don't you get us off with a story here as we jump into Karl Marx?
Yeah. So this is interesting is that there are people know that we do the podcast and I talk about the various individuals. We talked about Plato and Galileo in our previous podcast, and I was just relaying to them that we were now going to start talking about Marx. And they looked at me and said, "Oh, yeah, those Marx brothers. I always want to know more about those Marx brothers." I said, "Marx brothers?" And I said, "Are you talking about the vaudeville entertainers of the early 20th century?" And they said, "I don't know, but I know there's some Marx brothers out there." I said, "No, there's only one Marx that we're going to be talking about. His name's Karl Marx. Marxism, communism, socialism thoughts." And they just looked very embarrassed and said, "Oh, okay. Well, I need to know about him too." So we are not talking about the Marx brothers. We are going to talk about Karl Marx, the philosopher basically. So as Jason mentioned, is that, and this is a quote from a book that we're reading. If anyone wants to know about Karl Marx, it's called Karl Marx by Isaiah Berlin, just like the city in Germany, Berlin is his last name, Isaiah Berlin. And he wrote a biography about Karl Marx, and we're going to be using that pretty extensively to talk about his biography. And in it, he has this quote, or he states this. It says, "No thinker in the 19th century has had so direct, deliberate, and powerful an influence upon mankind as Karl Marx." And as Jason alluded to, in our present day, I guess in contrast to Plato and Galileo, it's not as if most people sit around talking about Plato or even think about what Plato wrote or even have a notion of how influential he is in our thoughts today or in our cultures today. And same thing for Galileo, is it's not as if the majority of people are contemplating the world's rotation and the sun and astronomical phenomena related to Galileo, even the thought of the telescope, nothing along those lines. But Marx is a completely different individual in that regard, and that I don't think you would have to be very sheltered not to have some notion or some influence of Karl Marx. Even today, we talk about the relationship between between Russia and the United States. You still have, I think, holdovers from the Soviet Union thinking that Russia is some type of communist country, or we have Cuba right off the coast of Florida. You still have that influence, is still a communist country. So I think there's still this notion, and the influence of Karl Marx is writings that still influence us day to day. And even in the political sphere, when you talk about socialism, I mean, many countries have not only socialists, but they have communists as part of their parties that go up for nomination. And so the whole idea of Karl Marx and his ideas still resonate with us day to day, and especially in the United States, and I think throughout the world for that matter, China for that matter, it still has a lot of Marxist ideas. One of the other things, one of the other quotes from Berlin's book is that he says this: "It has altered the history of human thought in the sense that after it, certain things could never again be plausibly said." So Karl Marx's ideas, as we're going to start talking about his life, he fundamentally changed the dynamics, especially social dynamics that occurred at that time, and the discussions that have happened since then. And let's just move to his life. And so his name is Karl Heinrich Marx. As Jason mentioned, he's German. He was born in Germany, in Trier, in 1818, May 5th of 1818. And Trier is directly west of Frankfurt, almost on today is Luxembourg and French border. It's pretty close to there. So at the time that Karl Marx was born, it was not a metropolitan area. Karl Marx is Jewish. His parents are Jewish. He's Jewish. He's the eldest son of eight. He has 8 siblings. He has one older daughter, one older sister. But he's the oldest male. And from all accounts, it doesn't look like he had much interaction with his siblings. He had some sympathies for his older sister, but no one else in the family. I think another interesting aspect of his family was that his mother was more or less absent from him and didn't show any general interest in him, at least from all accounts that I read. But then he had other influential individuals, and Jason's going to talk about these.
Yeah, I think the first one that jumped out at me is his father, and it was really, I was surprised. Or maybe not surprised. That he had a good relationship with his father, and his father saw that there was a lot of potential in Karl from a young age. I guess obviously he was intellectual. Described him as being difficult son in that way, but he still developed a good relationship with him. But as far as his father's own life, I think has some interest in it as well. So his father, let me pull up some information here. So his name was actually Herschel Levi, but he changed it to Hendrik Marx. And he did that because during the time that they lived there in Germany, under the German law that changed, being Jewish, he couldn't have a profession that he had of being a lawyer. And so this happened pretty young in Karl Marx's time. I don't know if you remember the exact time relative to.
It was probably within a couple of years after Karl's. I mean, it was under 5.
Yeah,
years of age.
So he converted to Lutheranism from Judaism, and although he wasn't really a practicing Jew, from what I gathered, it wasn't like they were devout religious practicing Jewish. But as I read that with his father, Heinrich, that it seemed like he went with the flow of the society, was okay to go Lutheran, never really practiced from what we gathered, but did it also really to help his profession. So I'm sure Karl saw some of that society couldn't help but have some influence on him during this time to see his father change religion and adapt to the society. I think that was probably some influence in seeing the changes around him. I guess one other thing that came with this is that even though he described some difficulty in his son being stubborn, being intelligent, he still had that love for him. And Karl actually loses his father at a pretty young age. I think he was in his 20s when his father eventually died, and that was an impact on him as well. And he had some tender relationships there with his father. So I did find it interesting, though, Vince, like you mentioned, that it didn't seem like he had a tight relationship with his mother at all.
Yeah.
And later in life, when Karl was doing all this stuff, his mother was essentially absent or wasn't part of that at all.
Yeah, it didn't seem like she was part of that. And I just found that fascinating because usually mothers, especially the mothers with their eldest sons, seem to have good relations, or at least some type of relationship. But from the accounts that I read, it seemed like she was so busy with the other 7 children just maintaining the household that she just really didn't have a relationship with him. No. So yeah, it just doesn't seem to mention her much.
Yeah, but another probably a key relationship, and this one I really find fascinating, is with a neighbor, and it's actually the friend of his father, of Carl's father. So one of Heinrich's friends, his name is Freiherr Ludwig van Westphalen, and eventually Carl would actually marry his daughter, but this guy was a little bit higher rank in terms of the class, but this guy took an interest in Karl Marx, and I think it's probably, we've talked about this before, Vince, and I've seen this in my own podcast, talking to different people in their different walks of life, but it seems like often people look back at their life and look at a certain person that came into their life at a certain time and had a real impact on them and kind of changed their whole trajectory of life. To me, when I look at this, Westphalen, he looks like that. He played that role for Carl. He was an older man, influential, I gather well respected, but he took an interest in Carl at a young age and shared with him the Greek tragedies, different works of art, talked about Shakespeare with him, and Homer, other classical things to read. So it started part of the education for Carl. But something that, maybe even more than that, gathering from the text that I read, is that he took just having an interest in Carl and paying attention to him and listening to him, having that correspondence with someone influential. It seemed to give Karl Marx a lot of, I guess, probably confidence in himself and ability to believe in himself. And it's just I find it fascinating that sometimes we have these things in life where we have that influence that comes in and seems to change that whole trajectory, like I said earlier. I don't know. Did you see that, Vincent, on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I thought it was fascinating. One, like you said, he was an older gentleman. He was higher class than the Marx were, so it was not even an older gentleman, but a highly influential gentleman of the community that took an interest in him. And to some degree, it made him sound like not necessarily an equal, but he respected Karl Marx as an individual who had ideas that were well worth listening to, and he cultivated that. Mm-hmm. And that, when he's sharing Cervantes with him, when he's sharing Shakespeare with him, when he's sharing Homer with him, he also shared a lot of the at that time were highly influential German philosophers and German writers such as Goethe or Schiller. So he cultivated this in Karl Marx, and as you said, I thought was the most fascinating thing is, according to the biographers, is that this instilled some confidence in Karl Marx as he went forward, that he didn't care if he was being criticized from the outside, or he didn't care that there were a lot of critics of his ideology that he's going to develop. He had a strong internal fortitude that said, I can do this is right, and I see it as right, and I think it was unshakable. And so I think it came from this gentleman, and I think it points to how influential we are when we're young and how important it is to have positive, strong role models or mentors.
Yeah, no, I thought that was pretty cool. And then, of course, I think we're probably getting more later after this one, but just to mention that he did marry this man's daughter named Jenny, and it's another key relationship in Karl Marx's life. He was married to her his whole life. They had a number of children together. From my gathering so far on that, we'll like I said, we'll dive more into it later, but my gathering on part of that relationship was just one of those pillars for Karl Marx himself throughout his life. So a lot came from this family, both the father and the daughter, for Karl Marx.
Yeah, and so, I mean, outside of his family, I think the other thing that was highly influential is the environment. So you had the culture, the people around him, and then you had the environment and we're talking about how it influenced who he became and who his ideologies were. So after, as we mentioned, his father was a lawyer, so it was pretty natural at that time that he encouraged Karl to attend a law school, and Karl attended law school in 1835 at the University of Bonn. And Jason mentioned is that, I mean, he probably wasn't the best of students.
This kind of reminds me of a little bit of going back to Galileo.
Yeah.
His father sent him off, and Galileo had other interests, but his father wanted him to. I forgot Galileo's was.
He wanted to be a physician.
Oh yeah, he wanted, yeah. And so in this case, Karl, his father, saying, "No, be a lawyer." See again, doctors and lawyers. Be a doctor, or be a lawyer, make the money. The fathers are encouraging, and here they are doing with Karl again. But he had other interests. I guess I would mention early on. You mentioned his father had to send him a letter, a reprimand, essentially, saying, "Karl, get your stuff together." It sounded like he was partying too much, drinking. I'm having a good time at college, which, still resonates down to our day. But it sounded like he had to get it straightened out there. And you mentioned that he was at Bonn, and then because of that, his father ended up sending him to the University in Berlin, which was more serious academically, from my understanding.
Yeah, and this is the interesting. And I'll say it would be analogous to saying Bonn, for what I gathered, was it's relatively rural, tight-knit community. So let's just say small town North Dakota, and that's where he was. And he goes from that to Berlin, which would be equivalent to going to New York City. So he goes from that, and in Berlin at the time, this is 1836, this was the epicenter for all the philosophical dialogue that was happening in Germany at the time. And one of the things that was happening was that Germany was trying to reclaim Germany, because we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that this is shortly after the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars ended in 1813, I believe. So a couple years before Karl Marx was born. And Germany had been invaded and had been, to a large extent, defeated during the Napoleonic Wars. And then at this time, Napoleon had been defeated, and Germany was trying to reclaim its Germanness. And one of the ways they did that was to elevate a lot of the German philosophers. And one of those was Hegel. So George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and he was a philosopher from 1770 to 1830. And his thoughts were very prominent in Berlin. And so were Voltaire's and Rousseau. So again, to just give you an idea, is he went from rural town, again, if you're United States, rural town, North Dakota, to New York City, the heart of New York City. And that's kind of the contrast. And he found himself in this culture that was completely different than what he was used to, and being exposed to philosophers and ideas that he'd never had encountered up to that point, I don't believe. And the ideas that were surrounding, this was the end of the Enlightenment period. So the Enlightenment period, especially Hegel, was very much imbued with the idea of reason, this boundless faith in reason, the ability of humans to reason. And reason is always right. This was a quote that comes from Berlin's book again. It says, "Arguments could be produced to show beyond any possible doubt that man was naturally good, that reason existed equally in all sentinel beings, that the cause of all oppression and suffering was human ignorance, produced partly by social and material conditions, which arose in the course of natural historical development, partly through the deliberate suppression of the truth by ambitious tyrants and unscrupulous priests, most frequently by the interplay of both." So you can almost see the hints right there of what Karl Marx is going to be talking about, is that throughout history, there's been this oppression or suppression of individuals by tyrants, or by what he calls the bourgeois, which are the upper class, those who have capital, those who have land. And you can kind of see that that's set at a seed. And again, he wouldn't have encountered this if he hadn't gotten to Berlin. So this is one of the influences. So he has the influences of people. Now he has the influences of his environment. And Jason's going to talk about historically what Karl Marx, just like Galileo, what the similarities are there.
Yeah, I think we're going to hit a lot more of this down the road in terms of the full influence of Karl Marx. I think we can relate this a little bit more in our time, like you mentioned at the beginning of it, so that in that his ideas are still with us, very much with us, very much talked about still. We have countries still following some of his teachings, so it's very maybe it relates to us a little bit more that way. But in terms of Karl Marx in his own time, we mentioned briefly that he started off in Germany. He'll spend time in Germany, spend time in France, but ends up in London for the last 30 some years of his life, and really dies kind of a quiet life. And I should mention that he died in 1883 at the age of what's that, 64?
64, yeah.
So kind of fairly young in some ways, but kind of also, as I read about his death and stuff, it was very not a huge celebrated moment. So he kind of died. I guess we can relate that to Galileo in terms of not a lot of fanfare at that time in his life, and really the big influence of his ideas and thoughts would come after his death. Again, like Galileo, maybe a little bit like Plato. Maybe that's something we're going to find, Vincent. A lot of these people that you make big influences in this world, a lot of that influence doesn't happen until you're long and gone.
That's it. Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because as I'm kind of shuffling through all the individuals we're talking about that we're going to talk about here, yeah, that's almost universally true. Is that the vast majority of their influence doesn't come until decades, in this case, hundreds of years after their death. In Marx's case, it's going to come in decades, but still, in their time, Karl Marx, just as Jason was mentioning, it wasn't well known. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't as if he was on London corners and having the halls filled of people talking about Marxism. This didn't happen. From everything that I read, he was relatively isolated, didn't even interact with Londoners that much, the English that much. He was with a small German enclave, mostly his family, and they just interacted amongst themselves. He wrote a lot, but he didn't interact with the Londoners or the English people that much. And he wasn't, for the most part, I thought he would be more celebrated, at least more well known, even with his writings, and it just didn't seem to translate that well at the time, at his time of his life.
So there you go. If you want to be real influential, you're not going to know about it anyway, because it's going to happen after your death. So,
so we have that, and then, I guess the other interesting aspect of this is, what was going on in Karl Marx's life. We mentioned some of the people he influenced: Hegel, Berlin, being more or less in London. So what was going on in this time that led him to this ideology of Marxism, or what would be called Marxism at the time, or Marxism now? And it's difficult because there's so many things that go into play. And we talked about the Napoleonic Wars ending in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. We have Napoleon's thought. I mean, the idea that there's this attempt the French Revolution was an attempt to overthrow the monarchy, overthrow aristocracy. It was an attempt to order and secure liberty and equality and fraternity among all men. So everyone was seen as equal. And you can see that as a Jew, as a Jew at the time, they were more or less ostracized. They were from common everyday European professions and merchants and commerce. They were ostracized. So you can see if that seed took root, how it liberated, and it did liberate a lot of Jews at the time of the French Revolution. And so it allowed the Jews to enter more or less mainstream European lifestyle. So that was part of it. I mean, I think the idea of freedom and the individual.
Mm-hmm. And Hegel was you're probably going to hit this, Vince, but Hegel was a big part of his influence. And one of the things I really liked about, Hegel's, I don't know in depth yet, we'll hit more of it down the road, but one thing I did like about some of that thought at the early time that Karl started to get influence is this idea about history. As Hegel looked back at history, it was oftentimes we have this view, like we look back at history and we're like, well, there's not much to learn there. We've progressed beyond that historical time. But one of Hegel's thoughts, and I think Carl adapted this as well, is no, actually, if we look back in history, there's things to be learned. There's probably each time period in history, there's something that society or that time period did better than we do now. And it should be looked at that way, with that kind of a learning attitude. I said, well, no, even though you look at the Roman period or something back in history, like, well, maybe they did, I don't know, maybe they did honor better than we do now. Mm-hmm. There's elements within the history that there's things to learn from. And I thought that was pretty good, because although I guess in the era I hear now that, yeah, we should learn from history, but how many of us really know something historically that we're learning from? I don't know if that's very many people. Like you kind of your introduction with the Marx Brothers is one of those, right? Where, is it the Marx Brothers or the Karl Marx? And who is this Karl Marx that just lived 150, 200 years ago, not that long ago, and has such a powerful influence? Most of us couldn't name what he did or contributions he made. So,
right. No, I think that's part. I mean, that's part of what. I mean, just mention the French Revolution. You didn't realize. I mean, you could start stringing together certain things. If the French Revolution hadn't happened, if Napoleon hadn't been defeated, would Karl Marx wouldn't have had those ideas? It's probably not. I mean, so. And if the Enlightenment hadn't happened, and we can keep going back further and further, if Galileo hadn't been there, if Plato hadn't been there, if all these things hadn't coalesced at the right time, at the right period, would we have what we have today in Marxism? Probably not. I mean, you had to have the right mixture. And it's important, I think, and that's part of the reason we are doing 73 Mentors, is to look back historically and say, what things do we have currently in everyday life that we take for granted, that's blatantly there, but we don't understand? And this is a prime example, is Marxism, is that it's there, but we don't fully understand. And again, as we go through this, I think at least to get a better understanding. Could we fully understand it? Probably not. But get a better understanding of all the dynamics that happen in order to weave and to come together to produce what is Marxism, and to produce an individual like Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea of the German country trying to get back to what it was prior to the Napoleonic Wars. It was trying to get back its identity, and in order to do that, it reverted back to a more feudal system, a very strict feudal system. And as Jason mentioned, one of the things it did is it restricted Jews. Mm-hmm. And that's why Karl's father became a Lutheran. And so this anti-Jewish sentiment happened in 1816, so 1 year after Karl Marx was born. So you can see that interplay too. And the interplay is that, again, we're at the end of the Enlightenment period. And so the dominating philosophy, and I think the idea here is this, and this is from Berlin's book again, quote, "The imagination of the 18th century was dominated by the phenomenal strides made by the mathematical and physical sciences during the previous century, and it was a natural step to apply the method which had proved so successful in the hands of Kepler and Galileo, Descartes and Newton, to the interpretation of social phenomena and to the conduct of life." So what was happening now is the Enlightenment period. We talked about Galileo, we talked about Kepler a little bit when we talked about Galileo. We haven't talked about Descartes or Newton. We'll be talking about Newton. But the idea is they use the scientific method in order to explain physical science or natural sciences. Now with the Enlightenment period, it's an attempt to use that same method in order to explain social sciences, in order to explain life. And that's what was happening during Karl Marx's time. And the idea of empiricism is basically what it is. And the idea that science can explain the social structure that we should live on and how a man should live. Yeah. And we get back to that same argument Jason had with Galileo, the discussion about science and how that fits in. And go ahead and let's I think this is an important topic.
Yeah, as you're going through this again, it was fun actually to see Galileo's name brought up right away. We're like, hey, Galileo, we just studied him. But I was thinking about the science thing, and we've talked about this a few times, Vince, and like you said, we talked about in our last episode and asking the question, where does science fit into the human experience? You know, as I first look at that, I'm like, you know, I consider myself a scientist, an engineer and scientist, and even in the air around me, I don't know of an area where you don't try to apply science and trying to understand something. And on a certain hand, I'm okay with that. It's like, okay, yeah, we should try to understand things scientifically. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that maybe it's not easy. Maybe science doesn't fit well with some of the things that we're trying to understand with science. And I mean, that idea kind of is somewhat uncomfortable at the same time, because it feels like, well, then what do you do with those ideas? Is it just you take these certain things on faith, belief? How do they mesh together? I'll give you an example. Like some things seem, I would say we've made strides in a great many places with science, and we'll take something complicated like you can take weather or something like that. Where I think I mentioned it last time, where the idea about understanding the weather was we just need to understand enough factors, enough variables within that system. If we can figure out those variables, and we can basically compute. Once we have enough of them, we can compute it and be able to tell you what the weather's going to do. Well, that first idea was probably expressed several hundred years ago, and you know, with the computing power and the information that we have now, we can get, you know, thousands and perhaps millions of factors trying to figure out weather. And we can have, you know, you could say, well, we do better than we did thousands of years ago in predicting and understanding weather and weather patterns and everything. Yeah, we do, but we still struggle to really fully describe the system. And it was, you couldn't see it. Even today, you couldn't say, what's the weather going to be like a week from now? Precisely. Mm-hmm. Next week, right now where I'm living, what's the weather going to be like? How much cloud cover is it going to be? How much sun will there be? We can't do that. There's too much variability in the system, too much complexity, things like that. So maybe I'll throw that back at you, Vince. Where does that science, in your view, fit into this human experience?
Yeah. So the hard thing is this is
softball for you.
Yeah, softball. You always give me those easy questions. I mean, I'm a scientist too. I mean, I would consider myself a scientist because of where I work is that we rely on studies all the time. Mm-hmm. The difficulty is this: is that if you truly boil down the scientific method, it has to be something it can be a fairly complex system, but that complex system has to be in order to test it, it has to be reproducible and predictable. And that's exactly where weather falls apart. Is it's not reproducible necessarily. It's not predictable all the time. So no matter how many variables you have, you're still going to have some unpredictability. In this contrast to what we were studying Galileo is that there's predictability in the rotation of the Earth, of the rotation of the moon, of the rotation around the sun. There's predictability, and it's reproducible. That's why they're able to do that. When we talk about Newton, there's most of his scientific discoveries are reproducible and predictable. And there's obvious elements of complexity. But I don't think that the complexity is the problem. I think the complexity, we can deal with the complexity. It's, can you only change one variable or a limited number of variables, and can you see that that's reproducible, and can you predict what's going to happen? And what we have here is that we're talking about social sciences. We're talking about history. What will be history? We're talking about economics. We're talking about the movement of millions of people at that time, and now several millions of people now. It's not the variables, is it reproducible? History doesn't repeat itself. Certain social occurrences don't repeat themselves. They may have similar patterns, but they don't exactly repeat themselves. We've never seen, again, a French Revolution. You've never seen another American Revolution. And even if we do, the revolutions that happen, they're not all the same. And so there's this idea that what was happening in primarily, I'll say in France and in England, and to a small extent Italy, is that they were thinking that because we went through the Enlightenment that we could then apply the same methods to social. And I think we attempt to do that now still. Yeah. And I think we fail. We fail miserably, and we wonder why we can't predict certain things. I'll throw another one out there. If economics.
Hmm.
If economics is so predictable, I mean, economics in itself is the commerce between individuals, millions of individuals every day. If it was so predictable, you and I and everyone else with any computer could say, oh, the stock market is going to be this tomorrow. It's going to rise 200 points, or it's going to drop 5 points, or pick a particular stock and it's going to be what it should be in 10 years. And we can't do that. I mean, no one can do that consistently. Can someone do it every once in a while? Sure. But can they do it consistently? No, because it's not reproducible and it's not predictable. So as I think I mentioned Galileo, I think we put too much faith, if you will, in science and its ability to provide answers for us, where in some situations it just isn't. And I think that's where we're at. And the empiricism, which is, let me define that. The empiricism that was happening at this time is basically, the empiricism is a theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. And this is started by Locke and Berkeley and Hume. And that we can derive that from that knowledge, we can then move forward and predict what's going to happen next. And that was more or less European empiricism. They looked at Galileo, they looked at Newton and said, look, they were able to look at the world and they were able to predict. And now now what we're in this particular time is they're trying to do that with society. And I think the fallacy of that is that the methods of natural sciences and the physical science, they can't be applied to all experiences. And they especially can't be applied to historical experiences. Historical changes or historical developments. And Hegel was one of the main philosophers in that realm, saying more or less contradicting or being contrarian to European empiricism put out by the French, saying, nope, this isn't going to work. That doesn't work. And that's where, again, Hegel's influence comes. And again, Karl Marx was heavily influenced by Hegel. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree to that to a certain level. I guess part of it's the uncomfortability of it, saying, well, if there's certain areas where we're not going to be able to gain more ground in science. I guess maybe first, this is the first idea I would submit first, that maybe we don't fully understand these systems. We can read the weather back or the economy, economic theories and stuff, but we have gained some understanding. They have given us some tools, some prediction, maybe not perfectly, but it's given us some things. So isn't there just enough value in that, and saying, okay, well, maybe my science, I will never be able to predict the weather 3 months from now. Okay, but I can give you a pretty good probability of tomorrow that, hey, it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Isn't there just enough value that to do what it's done so far?
No, I think there is value, and it's not that I'm discounting the value. I'm just skeptical of how much faith and trust we put into the ability to predict. The ability of science to predict and to control all elements of human existence. Yes, there's definitely value in that. But to put your faith in that science will one day be able to completely solve all the human problems and concerns and conflicts, I think is going overboard. It's going too much. It's putting too much faith in something that's really not. I just don't think it has the right method or ability. It's not even in the right frame.
No, that's good. Yeah, I could see that. I guess because I'm just looking at my own life experience, and there's parts of it I mentioned before that don't seem to fall within science and engineering and being able to explain it scientifically.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. I mean, I guess on a personal level, I'm okay with that. So I guess, again, it just kind of leads to this place where, like, well, then what do you do? What do you do with that? You say, well, I use science as much as I can, explain as much as I can, but I bring other methods and ideas in with it as well. And it seems to leave like an emptiness or a place that maybe we just haven't figured out yet as a whole.
No, and I think it's the uncertainty. It's the uncertainty of it that I think most people find difficult, in that science brings about a certain level of stability and certainty. So if, okay, I use this study or I demonstrated by this method
Mm-hmm.
and I got this outcome. I did it again. I did it again. I did it again. I did it a million times. It came out the same outcome. There's some certainty in that. There's some comfort in that. And I think just as being humans, we want stability and we want comfort. The only thing I'm pointing out is that there are certain things that will never, there are certain things that will always have uncertainties in them. And I think we just more or less choose not to acknowledge those or be aware of those as much as we like.
No, I think, you know, part of that and I share this, it's this concept of growing up in, you know, you grow up in the air around you, so you don't even notice it. But at least kind of one of those foundational things of myself, I feel is like, we'll figure it out. As a society, as a human, as a race, we'll figure it out. We've been figuring it out. We've seen hard problems hit us before, but we'll figure it out. And I guess a base structure of that figuring it out is science. And science plays a key role in that. We'll keep figuring it out. But if you say, well, we haven't figured these out, well, but we're going to bring in artificial intelligence. That'll be more intelligent than this. That'll help us solve it. Or you can name a number of things. Genetic engineering. Then we'll become superhumans. We'll figure it out then. There always seems to be another step that we could still take in that. But I just think it's a cool thought to think about. That well, maybe there's areas that we need different approaches to. That's an interesting concept to me, and it shouldn't be really, because I mean a lot of my life has been that way, but it's interesting to think about it this way.
No, I think it is. I mean, if we go, I mean, we can been covering the past. So we jumped 200 years from Galileo to Marx. We jumped 200 years essentially, and you see the enormous amount of progress humanity has made. And I think from that, I mean, we even go back to the Reformation in the 1300s, is that from the 1300s till present day, there's been these sometimes leaps, but almost this progression in technology and understanding has improved in certain areas. How we, diseases, how we understand diseases, how we understand the human body, how we can control or at least somewhat control our environment. We have houses and sanitary facilities. You have all of that. So I think it's one of those things that you just mentioned, is we're so imbued with the ideas that this is the way it's always been, so we continue to progress, that we're continuing to progress, that why not think that way? Because we've been thinking that way for now over 800 years now, closing in on 800 years, over 800 years. So why shouldn't it be? And I think that's true. I mean, I think there are certain things that we can still get better at. My point is that there are certain things that we've not gotten better at. We're in certain human conditions, we're no different than a gentleman, a man or woman in the 1200s. We still struggle with the same. When we studied Plato, his writings were so contemporary, and that was over 2,000 years ago. He still was struggling with a lot of the same things we're struggling with. So my only point is that science definitely has a benefit in certain sectors. In other sectors, it just doesn't seem to have any application, or as much application as we would like.
All right.
Let me give you again an idea of what Marx was moving towards and what Hegel was talking about. And this is a quote again from Berlin's book. It says, "It seems impossible to account for, even to express, the individual character of a particular personality or period of history, the individual essence. That is the purpose, embodied in a particular work of art or science, by the method of natural science. For even though its characteristics may indeed closely resemble something that has occurred before or after it, yet its totality is in some sense unique, and existence only once. This cannot therefore be accounted for by a scientific method, whose successful application depends upon the occurrence of the precise opposite, namely the same phenomena the same combination of characteristics, should repeat itself regularly, recur again and again. So the whole point of that is that there are certain systems, we'll say, that don't regularly repeat, that are outside the scientific method. And that's what Hegel was talking about, and that's what Karl Marx is going to be talking about. And especially Karl Marx is going to be applying this to history, is that history does not have this recurrence and repeated platform about it, and that you can't necessarily predict it as well as you could a ball falling from a tower or the earth rotating. And that's where we're at, and that's what the German philosophers were more or less in putting forward against the empiricism of Europe at the time.
That's it. I just find it interesting. I think it's something that you don't hear, at least in my circles. I've never really heard. I don't know if I've ever heard the statement like, well, science wouldn't apply there, other than maybe faith and religion. Maybe some people have the science, but otherwise, I don't think I ever heard him. Well, science doesn't have anything to say about that. No, that seems very foreign idea.
Right.
So it's interesting these guys were thinking about this back then.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't. I think you'd be very out of step with modern day individuals if you said, "Yeah, science doesn't apply there," or let's not look at the scientific method here. That doesn't apply. Let's go off of emotions or whatever you want to. Let's look at history to see if it gives us any clues. No, let's more or less lean on scientific method. And when we talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about this, is that delve into Marx's solution. What was about Marx? What was his ideas? And go ahead, Jason. Why don't you start us off with a quote?
Yeah, this is again from the book that we're reading that talked about Marx. Gives a little sense of his characteristics, some of his thought. Says this: he detested as passionately as any 18th century thinker emotionalism, belief in the supernatural causes, visionary fantasy of every kind, and systematically underestimated the influence of such non-rational forces as nationalism and religious and racial solidarity. So, to me, it speaks very much of this, very much on rational thought.
Mm-hmm.
What can be proved? Those kind of thoughts and thinking, and a little bit, maybe touching a little bit on what we just talked about, and say, hey, if it's not within that science realm, if you can't hold that firmly, then it's not. There's a lesser value to it.
I think it's the idea that not only the scientific realm, but it's also the rational mind, and that we've in the Enlightenment period, we've reached a point where God is part of the equation. And I think Jason had a perfect. We were talking about this earlier. Is that God has become the appendage, has become a appendage.
Mm-hmm.
He's no longer the central guiding force of an individual. He may be a small appendage, he may be a pinky, he may be an arm, but he's certainly not the internal driving part that would happen in Galileo's time, let's say. And we see, to a large extent, faith or religions losing a lot of their influence on people. Not that it didn't have still huge influence. It's nowhere near what it was in Galileo's time, though. And we see the rise of the rational mind. We see the rise of the individual freedoms, the thought that man can figure this out on his own, and man has the tools. If given the right environment and given the right education, he can guide humanity to a utopian society. That's what I think we're moving towards.
Well, I mean, I guess kind of throwing that argument out there and say, well, hey, it's been good, Vince.
Mm-hmm.
We pushed God. He's just an appendage now. He was the essential big thing in Galileo's time, and it wasn't good for the people. But we've progressed beyond that, and now it's appendage for some people out there that may want it. Other people that don't need to have it there. So it's a big deal. It's all right.
Another softball, huh? Another softball question.
Another softball for you.
Well, this is again. I think this is the realms. This is the realm that are the sectors that science doesn't fit into, that the rational mind doesn't fit into. Is those, if the rational mind and the scientific method was able to answer those type of questions, then why are we still struggling with the same human conditions that Plato had, that Galileo had? It's because I think that there has to be some God element that provides answers to that. The rational mind, even it's at its best, as its most acuteness, still has some flaws in it. So still misses some stuff that the great stories of the past fill in. We go back to history, is that the great stories of the past, the stories of Christianity, and you can pull in other religions too. What do those stories do? They fill in those spots that allow us to be more human. Scientific method doesn't allow us to be any more human. Rational thought, to a large degree, attempts to do that, but doesn't allow us to be any more human. So, I mean, to answer your question is, yes, we progressed a lot, but we still deal with a lot of the same drawbacks of humanity that we've always had. And when God becomes an appendage, it doesn't facilitate us becoming any more human. And I think it's only through God that we start developing that. Yeah, if we want to use Plato's terms, the form of the good. Because the rational mind is not the form of the good. It thinks it's the end-all, be-all, but there's something better than that. There's some virtue, there's some truth that's beyond what the rational mind has accessibility to in and of itself.
Okay. That's an area that we're going to be, I guess, working on for quite a while.
Yeah, we're going to figure that out. I don't think we'll be the last ones to talk about this, because this is what they struggle from. I mean, they've been talking about since Plato's time. It's trying to figure this out.
Yeah, you're getting back to the very basics of all of this. Is, what is truth? How do we know truth? Where do we find that? Where do we set our foundations for our own life? Tough questions for some. Softballs for you. No, not softballs, but that's funny. Well, that's what they were. I mean, the whole movement of empiricism, the French Revolution. We can talk about other philosophers, Plato. What were they looking for? They were looking for a truth. They're looking for something to allow humanity for us to become more human. I mean, Marx is doing the same thing. That's what he's going to do. He's trying to find a method and a faith and a path to become, how can as many people as possibly become more human, become more of a person. I mean, we'll talk about, I mean, he's looking at it as, this is a class. This is the reason that some people cannot become more human is because it's a class. It's a conflict between classes. That's why it's not able. That's why we're not able to. I mean, he's presenting another truth. He's presenting a truth. He's attempting to get to a truth, just like Hegel is trying to get to a truth. Just like Voltaire's and all the philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, they're trying to get to a truth, to allow man to be fully what he is supposed to be. Yeah. No, that's good. It's like throwing that out there.
Yeah.
Got to bring it up every now and then, work it over a little bit.
So listen, why don't we talk about, I mean, one of the things that was mentioned in here is that dialectic. Now, we talked about the dialectic during Plato, and dialectic was the idea that Jason and I are coming together. We're looking for a truth. Jason brings some ideas, I bring in other ideas, and we engage in what's considered a dialectic in order for us to find a better truth, or a bigger truth, if you will. And so we engage in that, and we go back and forth, and then we emerge from that with a truth, and that's considered a dialectic process or dialectic method. And in here, Hegel mentions a dialectic also, and it still consists of two sides. But in Hegel's definition and Hegel's thought is that these two sides are in conflict. They're not trying to get to some resolution. Sometimes they're aware of each other, sometimes they're not, and they attack each other to the point where both of them become fully aware to a certain extent. They each exist, and in their ultimate conflict, they ended up destroying each other. But after the destruction, a new idea emerges. And so he points to Christianity as an example. So you saw Christianity in conflict with the Roman Empire and with Judaism at the time. And what happened? They, in a sense, destroyed it, and then a new Christianity was the emergence of a new idea, if you will, a new evolution of human thought, of human existence. They pointed to another example is the fall of Rome. The emergence of Rome and the fall of Rome are both an example of this conflict, where Rome was in conflict with the other barbarians, and then eventually it just fell. And then you see the Dark Age, and then you see the Renaissance. You see the Reformation, and then you see the Renaissance, and then you see the Enlightenment. So all those are examples of what Hegel's looking at, is that you have this conflict between ideas, and then out of that emerges something entirely new. And we're going to see that Karl Marx is kind of alluding to that too. And the two sides that Karl Marx is looking at is he's looking at capitalism versus Marxism are the two sides. And from that, he's predicting something emerges that's new.
Yeah. No, that's good, because we're essentially getting Karl Marx up into his college years, and that's where we're going to end this discussion here today, and we'll continue on with that. But you're going to see, I guess in the studies already, you see a lot of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this conflict throughout in Karl Marx's arguments too. It's class conflicts, mm-hmm. where he goes to, but it's a different view for me to think about things in so much conflict. I guess I don't normally see the world out there where there's just all these conflicts, and not that I don't see conflict, but that it's the central thing that gets to this breaking point. So that's going to be interesting. Another thing that we're seeing with these 73 mentors is being good communicators in some form or another. Plato, obviously, I think a great lecturer at the time. Also wrote some things down that lasted for us to have, so there was a way for her to communicate there. I think Galileo was probably phenomenal in both an orator as well as in his writings, and also being prolific enough, having enough volume of things out there that I think that's part of his influence. And we see some of that here with Karl Marx too, although it's a little more, I didn't see it right away in terms of some of these writings talking about Karl Marx being, I don't want to say almost recluse when he was in London. People didn't know him. He's kind of go and study and write on his own. He wasn't an orator out there speaking and making big waves, but he did do writing. And those writings started calling ripple effects during his time, and they continue to carry on. So I just thought I'd bring that up again, that again we're seeing this. I guess I've always thought the importance of communication is key, even in our own lives, right? For my career, for influencing even my family members, if you want to go even to that level. But how key it is for us to, I mean, it seems obvious, right? If I can't communicate what's inside of me out to other people, then what value of it is it really? So in terms of, I guess I'm fascinated by that, being able to communicate well. I think Karl Marx did it through writing. And I think maybe I don't fully appreciate yet the Communist Manifesto, which was essentially a pamphlet at the time, but how well circulated that became, and I could almost see the ripple effects, and almost rippled out to the society, and then which led people, and I guess from my view so far, led people back to Karl Marx and to see his further teachings.
Yeah, I think it's back to Karl Marx, is that in his ideas, I don't think, from my gathering, is that anything he put together in and of themselves, individually, the thoughts were there already. What he did was he synthesized them. And if you were to use like a scientific idea, is that he brought multiple different disciplines together and put it in a way, we saw this in Galileo, and we saw this to a certain extent with Plato, is that he put them in a way that was accessible to a larger number of people. Hegel's not that accessible to most people. I mean, it's a hard read. Voltaire to a certain extent. Rousseau is a little bit more accessible. But you think about those type of philosophers, their ideas are not that accessible. Even the list that Berlin provided that of all the influences Karl Marx, I honestly have heard of probably less than 20% of them. But he was like, this guy influenced him this way, this guy influenced him this way. I mean, I've not even heard of them, and probably their writings are probably obscure and difficult to understand. But what it goes back to a good communicator. What did Karl Marx do? He took all these ideas and he put them in a format, in a way, and disseminated them in a way that was accessible to the masses. If anyone can, I think most people can read Communist Manifesto and within the first paragraph understand what he's talking about. He's where if you and I sat down and we read the first couple pages of Pure Reason by Hegel, we're going to be stumbling around in the dark for a long time for us to understand any of that. So again, a good communicator, and we've recognized this, is can he write? Yes. Can he write well? Yes. But what does he write? That's I think even more important is what does he write? Is that, yeah, all these guys could, I mean, these philosophers were great writers, but was it accessible to the everyday person? Because it's hard, and especially in Karl Marx's case, if he had basically framed it in a way that was inaccessible, it would have never gained traction. But he framed it in such a way that your everyday worker, your everyday laborer, which is he's on the side of, could pick up the pamphlet and understand what he's talking about. An everyday laborer could understand the bourgeois. He could understand that I'm being oppressed, that I'm being used, and he could kind of get some enthusiasm and get some momentum behind that, where I don't know if you could have done that with the other philosophers that he was getting these ideas from. I don't think so.
That's good. That's good. So why don't I round it up here?
Yeah, round it off. Round it off.
Okay, I'm going to share. This is I'll give you a little background. This is a little story I ran into probably some 20 years ago, plus. At least part of it. A fraction of the story I heard someone tell. And it impacted me back then. It got me thinking about really human potential. And I think that comes to play with very much with 73 Mentors and what we're looking at and diagnosing and trying to get better understanding of. So I took those fractions that I had way back then and I've tried to construct a story around that. And I'll go and tell it to you. So thousands and thousands of years ago, there was a boy born in a village. And he was a special boy. He was born with a triangle, almost a perfect triangle on his arm. And when the village elders heard of this, they all came to see. And they saw that, and some spoke of it, hey, this is a great blessing of things to come. That's a mark of something great. While others said, no, no, no. That's a sign of cursing. Bad things will be coming of this boy. But he was born to good parents, well respected in the village. And they raised him and taught him, and he continued to grow. And pretty soon when he was a little bit older, he was playing around with kids, and they'd point to his triangle and say, what is that about? And someone would make fun of him. And some kids would stay away from him, not play with him at all. So he'd ask his mother about that and say, hey, Mom, what is this on my arm? And she reminded him, well, that's a sign of the gods, that you're going to be a blessing to you and to this whole village. And he liked that idea, and he kept that idea. Well, when his name was Rahul, and when he got to be about 12 years old, things really changed for him. A great storm came through the village, a storm like had never been seen before. There was great thunders and lightnings, and the waters rose. Now his parents were fishermen, and in their attempt to try to secure the boats, they were washed away and never seen again. Several of the other villagers lost their lives in that great storm as well. And Rahul had to go live with his uncle, who was his only kin. His uncle was a farmer. And so Rahul went and started working the farm with his uncle and started learning the ways of farming as much as he did fishing with his parents. But pretty soon, a couple seasons later, the crops failed. And many of the villagers were starving and hungry. And his uncle, downtrodden for the loss of his family and the loss of his farm, turned to drinking. And pretty soon, one night, he never came home and left, never to be seen. And about that time, the villagers started talking about Rahul and his mark on his arm and say, no, see, we said bad things are coming from this child. But luckily for Rahul, the blacksmith spoke up for him and said, no, 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 that's not true. I'll take him in. He'll become part of my household, and I'll train him and teach him to be a blacksmith. for the blacksmith, he didn't have any children of his own. And so Rahul joined his house and his family and started learning blacksmithing. And we learned how to make the fires in the morning and stoke the fires and get the iron, start melting it. And he loved that because the blacksmith would often tell him stories about his youth, for the blacksmith had traveled many miles and had many adventures when he was young. But luck wouldn't follow Rahul, and within a season, the blacksmith got sick one day and passed away unexpectedly. And again, all the rumors came back, and the villagers started speaking and saying, Rahul, this Rahul and his mark on his arm is bringing nothing good to our village. Well, another tradition that had been with this village for many thousands of years is that every 100 years they would send someone up, a volunteer, to go up to the great mountain, the mountain castle where the gods lived. And that villager would ascend, and it would bring blessings to the village for the next 100 years. Well, it was a time to make the choosing on who would be the honored one to go up to the great mountain castle and challenge the gods. Well, in that group, the whole village gathered, and Rahul was among them. And he volunteered, and he raised his hand. He said, I will go and do this. And that caused a great murmuring and stirring within the village, because it was normally a great honor. But the elders of the village got together and talked about it and said, well, perhaps we can complete two tasks with one here. We can get rid of our nuisance in Rahul and also appease the gods. Let's send him. And so it was decided that Rahul would go up to the great mountain castle and see the gods for this challenge to bless the village. And so he made his way, gathered his things, and off he went. It was a long journey, but he finally got there to the great mountain castle with this huge stone door, and he knocked on it. Doo, doo, doo. And finally the door opened, and a little old lady, all dressed in white, opened the door, welcomed him in, guided him, led him into the room, had him sit down, but never said a word. And so Rahul sat there in the room, not feeling very comfortable, having doubts in his mind about the villagers. Maybe that curse, maybe that triangle on my arm is a curse, but still hearing the words of his mother that it was to be a blessing. Well, pretty soon, another gentleman dressed in a green robe walks in, arranging the furniture, setting things in order, sets a chair across from Rahul, and asks Rahul, please move this table between us so we can sit and properly visit. Well, Rahul went to grab that table and couldn't move it. It wasn't a large table, kind of a normal sitting table. He tried to move it again and moved it, and finally he put all his strength into everything he had, and he could barely pick up one corner of it and slide it just ever so bit. And he said, I'm sorry, I cannot move this table. And so the green robe man grabbed it and said, I'll do it myself. And he put it in place. And he said, I'm busy arranging things in the castle. I must leave now. And he walked out the room. Well, Rahul sits back down, and pretty soon a beautiful woman dressed in a blue robe or blue dress comes in, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling liquid. And just to see her, Rahul would feel so much more at peace and comfortable. And she smiles and sits down before him and sets the glasses and says, Rahul, welcome to our castle. Please share a drink with me as we visit. And so she handed him one drink, and she took another. And Rahul has a few drinks. He said, what is this? Well, she said, it's juice of the finest fruits from all the lands. And it sure was tasty. And he tasted a little bit of it. And he says, well, I'm so glad you know who I am, and I have so many questions. She said, no questions yet. Let us first drink. And so she drank some, and he drank some, and pretty soon she finished her glass and set it down. And Rahul looked at his glass, and it was still full. And she says, well, when you come and a god offers you drink, you must drink. And he said, well, I am. And so he drank and drank and drank and drank and drank as much as he could, and it went down scarcely 2 inches. And he set it down because I can drink no more. So she gathered up the glasses and said, very well. And she walked out of the room. Now Rahul was feeling a little bit bad about that, but pretty soon another gentleman, all dressed in red, a fierce-looking man, quick in his movements, darted in and out and sat on the chair across from Rahul, looked at him with a penetrating look. And Rahul had to pull himself back because it was so sharp, and that he had no choice. Pretty soon this man says, don't you feel a chill in this room? Would you please start the fire? As he pointed to the fireplace sitting there next to him. Rahul was like, well, I don't, not thinking he was feeling very cool at the moment, but said, certainly I'll start that fire. So he got up and started trying to make sparks to get the fire going. He got this little tinder there and his little bit of wood and started trying to make fire like he did so many days as a blacksmith. But he couldn't get it going, and he tried and sparks, and finally he got a little flame to go. And he got it cultivated just a little bit, but as he moved the twigs around to get it going, it went out. And about that time, the robed figure standing above him, and Rahul says, I don't know, perhaps the wood is wet. And the gentleman says, I don't think it's wet. And he grabbed the stones and made several sparks, and pretty soon the fire went. And within a short time, it had filled the whole fireplace. And Rahul sits back down, feeling very disappointed. And the man looks at him as well and shakes his head, and he walks out. Well, Rahul's sitting there thinking about what is going on here. This place is so different than what I thought. I thought I was coming here to trials and be tried by the gods, and things are confusing. He's going through his head, and again, he's thinking about the words of his mother and the words of the villagers. And about that time, the little old lady appears at the doorway again. This time, she's all dressed in black, and she motions to him to follow her. And so Rahul follows her, and she leads into another room, a great war room, for it was lined with weapons of every kind on each wall. And she gestures to him for him to pick a weapon. And so Rahul's like, okay, now this is a challenge. This must be the challenge, right? This is how it happens. So he grabs himself a sword and a shield, his best weapons that he knew well. And as soon as he did so, the little lady grabbed a sword and a shield identical to his. And he looks at her in confusion. Am I to battle this little old lady? Certainly this isn't the case. And in that moment, she grabs that sword and the shield and stands up with the quickness of a young man, of a warrior even. And so the battle commenced. Blow for blow, they're going at it. And Rahul is trying every trick he knows from all his combat to get the better of the little old lady, but never does. And they fight and fight and fight to exhaustion. And finally they're interrupted by claps and laughter as the three other gods are standing there at the side of the hall. The green, the blue, and the red. And they say, enough of this. We'll be challenged no more by these mere mortals. You could not even beat a little old lady. But we will be merciful upon your kind this one last time. And we're sending you back to the village to give warning to all others not to come here to the castle anymore. For we will not receive you every 100 years as we have hitherto done. Because you have been failed worse than all that have come before you, Rahul. So let this be your merciful return to your village. And so they sent him away, and Rahul went back to his village, feeling defeated and down, knowing that he did not accomplish the things that he thought he went to accomplish. But that night, in that great mountain castle, things were different, as had never been before. As the four gods sat pondering and thinking and speaking quietly one to another about what they had just witnessed. The green god of earth sat pondering and explaining, I had never seen a mere mortal as I had in Rahul come and lift the great table, which was equal to 1/4 of the earth's weight, and be able to move it. Likewise, the blue god of water and life, she said, no, I've never seen this before either. Where more mortal came and drank from our great cups, and lowered the seas of the ocean by 2 inches. And the red god of fire and energy likewise said, no, I've never seen this before either. Where mere mortal came in and stoked the fires of the earth and lit a great volcano in doing so. And for the first time, the little old lady spoke. She said, I have never seen this either. Where mere mortals came and fought with death herself and met her blow for blow, and she could not gain the advantage. And so they trembled, the gods of the great mountain castle that day. Meanwhile, Rahul returned to the village, and true to his word, he spread the word, we are not to go back. We have been warned that the gods will not receive us anymore, for we are not worthy of such a challenge again. And the word spread, and the fear spread, and no one went back to the Great Mountain Castle. And it went on, and pretty soon the people had forgotten, all the way down to our day, where we no longer know the story, and no one knows where the Great Mountain Castle is.